Our next speaker will be Ktena. Hello, Ira. Can you see and hear us?
Yes.
Awesome, awesome. Ira Ktena, pronouns she, her. Ira's talk will be about graph representation learning for disease prediction and beyond. Ira is currently working as a research engineer in DeepMind and is working on incubation of cutting-edge research. Previously, Ira has been working, has been a senior machine learning researcher at Twitter and was focusing on real-time personalization and causal analysis for recommendations. So I'm sure I'll have actually some questions as I'm very interested in anything that has anything to do with causality. Ira has completed a doctoral degree in medical image computing at Imperial College London, and is serving now as an advisory board member. Ira's research focuses on developing methods for modeling and analyzing graph-structured neuroimaging data at an individual and population level using traditional graph theoretical approaches and geometric deep learning. And during her PhD, Ira has spent time at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. In these places, she worked on outcome prediction for ischematic stroke patients. And I think that's it in terms of introduction. So I'm handing it over to you, Ira.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Let me just share. Can you see my screen? Yes.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, perfect. Cool. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about graph representation learning in healthcare and beyond, which has been the main topic of my PhD, and I'm still kind of continuing work in that domain. So first of all, for those of you that are not familiar with graph theory, and graph representation learning, I'm going to give a high-level introduction, and then I'm going to talk about some applications of graph neural networks, which is a specific set of methods in graph representation learning, the applications in neuroscience and healthcare. So these are areas that I focused on during my PhD. And then I'm going to cover a kind of wider range of applications where graph representation learning has been used in more recent years. So first of all, in case you're not familiar with graph theory, graphs are essentially a mathematical term for networks, which I guess most of us are familiar with. And they're used to model pairwise relations between data points. So as you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, we can have a set of entities, a number of objects that correspond to the network nodes, and then the edges of the graph capture the pairwise similarities or some kind of relationship between these data points. So in that regard, graphs or networks, they offer a global view of the data structure that we're investigating. At the same time, graphs allow us to extract global meaningful patterns rather than focusing on kind of local interactions between our entities, and hence insights about our data. At the same time, they can help us increase performance in certain tasks, like, for example, classification. And I'm going to show an example of that later on in my talk, where we can leverage pairwise similarities. And last but not least, there are certain tasks that are only designed on networks. Like, for example, if we're working with social networks and we're looking at how fake news propagate in a social network, then it's a very natural way to model the problem, and it kind of augments the signal that we have by a lot. One high-level distinction between the types of graphs that we might encounter is distinction between natural and constructed graphs. So all around us, there's a wide range of natural graphs that we might observe. This includes social, biological, communication, transportation, and power networks. And these are characterized by the data inherently lying on this graph structure. So we don't need to construct the graph ourselves and make any decisions. And these are often encountered in medical, social, communication data, or transportation networks, and as you can see on the right-hand side, or brain networks where we actually have structural white matter tracts that define our underlying graph structure. In other cases, we have constructed graphs, which are inferred from the data, and then the computational time of obtaining this graph structure is often quadratic to the number of nodes available. One such example are the 3D meshes. This is an example 3D mesh of the heart. And there's no universal recipe for those, and the recipe to construct them is often domain specific. So I guess many of you are familiar with the successes of deep learning in the Euclidean domain. So it's standard 2D images or videos. So in computer vision, there's been major breakthroughs in the last decade that really pushed performance by a lot in traditional computer vision tasks. But I wanted to start with an example from the medical domain and in healthcare. That was this UNet architecture that was published in 2015, and it was used for cell segmentation. So on the right-hand side, you can see the results of this segmentation model onto different data sets. And in color, you can see the segmentations produced by the model, while the yellow outlines correspond to the annotations of the human, the ground truth human annotators. So you can see that the performance is already quite impressive, and this is summarized in the table that on the lower right side of the slide, where UNet hugely outperforms other approaches for this task. However, even though these successes have been plenty in this Euclidean domain, so with standard images and videos, these models, they don't directly translate to irregular domains. So when we have to deal with graphs, for example, we need to understand what the analogies between the two are. So in the Euclidean domain, we have a regular pixel or voxel grid, while in the irregular domain, we have the graph structure on which our data lies. And even though in the Euclidean domain, we have a fixed number of neighbors per pixel or voxel, and an intrinsic node ordering, we know which node is top, bottom, left, or right to a particular, with respect to a particular pixel. But in a graph, in the graph domain, we may have a variable number of neighbors per node and no particular ordering. So for example, if we're looking at a Twitter graph, we might have some accounts that have 1 million followers, and there might be other accounts that have only 10. So if we wanted to kind of define some kind of aggregator functions, it would not be easy to translate the filters that we've learned in standard, Euclidean domains to the irregular domain. In terms of the signal that we observe in either case, the image intensities translate to a feature vector for each of the nodes in our graph. And the image classification task is equivalent to a graph classification task, while an image segmentation task is equivalent to a node classification task. So in an image segmentation task, we want to identify, in this previous example that I showed, we want to know which pixels in the images correspond to cells. In the node classification setting, we would need to predict a label for each node in our graph. And why is this interesting for neuroscience and healthcare? But in particular, neuroscience, there's a whole field of work called Conectomics that is looking at the brain from a network perspective. And why is that interesting is because cognition is a network phenomenon. So several cognitive tasks that we perform as humans, they emerge from interactions between different brain regions. And apart from that, there's also certain disorders, neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric, for which there's no physical trace, but there's only changes in the wiring and the strength of the connections. So on the right-hand side is kind of a pipeline that allows us to get from a raw medical image to a network representation of the brain. First, we would subdivide the brain into functionally coherent brain regions with a parcellation that is equivalent to a clustering technique. Then we gather imaging data for each of these regions. Either it's structural information or it's neurophysiological information that we obtain in the form of a time series. And then by either counting the number of structural connections between every pair of brain regions, or by estimating some level of like covariation between the neurophysiological signal between two regions, we can get a structural or functional brain network respectively. Now, how do we perform predictions on these brain graphs? From the raw connectivity matrices that are essentially symmetric, if we're talking about undirected graphs, square matrices, which is regions by region size, brain regions by brain region size, we can directly embed the entries of these connectivity matrices into one-dimensional vectors, which correspond to the upper triangular elements of these connectivity matrices. And these are associated with some target labels that we then want to predict. In this particular example, we want to distinguish between individuals with autism spectrum disorders versus neurotypical individuals. Then in the standard setting, we would perform some dimensionality reduction because these embeddings tend to be quite high dimensional, and train our classification model on top. Later on, we would apply the same dimensionality reduction or transformation to our test set and predict labels for these unseen individuals and report our performance on this test set. So this is kind of a standard setup for working with brain graphs. Now, one method that we worked on during the last year of my PhD was aiming at leveraging information on top of the imaging data that is often available in large population studies in neuroimaging. And what we wanted to do is quite often there's information like which acquisition site was used to obtain the imaging data for a particular individual, or what is the age and what is the sex of the individual, which is often quite important depending on what type of disease we're actually focusing on. And we wanted to capture this information in the population graph in which an individual is now a node in this graph, and it's associated with a feature vector that captures the imaging information, while the edge weights essentially complement this information with phenotypic data that is not captured by the network, the feature vectors. And then once we obtain this population graph representation, we would feed it through a set of graph convolutional layers to obtain labels for a set of unseen individuals, given the information that we have available on individuals with observed labels. Using this framework for distinguishing between neurotypical and neurodiverse individuals. So if you focus on the box plots in the rectangular shape, we wanted to see what the impact of the graph structure itself is. So if you look at the box for that is annotated as all, which means that every node in this population graph is connected to every other node. So essentially, the graph does not carry any information on top of the feature vectors of the nodes. And we could compare that to the phenotypic graph in light purple that carries all this auxiliary information that accompanies our imaging data. And we can see that by having a meaningful graph and performing classification, semi-supervised classification on top of that, we can get up to 10% performance improvement in terms of classification accuracy. Another thing that we, in neuroscience, what we mostly care about is actually understanding where not only getting the best predictive performance, but also understanding where the differences between two or more classes come from. And we were able to identify these differences using graph saliency maps. And you can see here for an application for sex classification, we were able to interpret and visualize the filter maps that are essentially the intermediate layers that are used in our network to provide these predictions of X or Y class for a particular individual. Using class activation mapping, we could identify the brain regions that are associated with the differences between the two classes. And in this study, we were able to recover areas that have been highlighted by previous neuroscientific studies to differ between male and female individuals. And of course, this was more of a proof of concept, but this becomes more and more, much more important when we're dealing with a certain neurophysiological or neurodevelopmental disorder. Now, beyond healthcare, the applications of graph neural networks and graph representation learning are numerous, and especially in the last 5 years or so, the range of applications has really expanded significantly. So one application that was emerged from a collaboration between DeepMind and Google Maps was for traffic prediction, and more specifically more accurately estimating the ETAs for different routes using super segments. There's applications in physics to better understand the glass structures and how the structure changes in glassy items. For fake news detection, there was an application, there was a method that was developed a couple of years back, and it would rely on patterns of the cascades in which certain news links are propagated in the Twitter network. And it was able to identify with above 90% accuracy whether a news source corresponded to real or fake news using graph neural networks. under the hood. And another application from chemistry has been recently published at the Cell journal from MIT, where they used graph neural networks as part of a deep learning framework that would allow drug repurposing. And they use this approach to discover new antibiotics. So you can see that the range of applications is really very wide at the moment, and there's a lot more to do in that space. What I personally feel quite passionate about recently is more recent application of graph neural networks in combinatorial optimization, and especially focusing on integer programming, which is one of the CARP's 21 NP-complete problems. So an integer program is essentially when we have a linear objective function that we're optimizing for, either minimizing or maximizing, a set of linear constraints, and on top of that, we have some integrality constraints for our integer, for our variables in the system. Excuse me. And on the right-hand side, you can see the black dots are essentially the feasible solutions, and they are kind of discrete in space because of these integrality constraints that we have. We refer to the problem as mixed integer program when on top we not only have integrality constraints, but also some of the variables in our problem are continuous. And we encounter such problems in a dozen of real-world applications that include packing, scheduling, routing, matching, placing, and many more. So this is a line of research that is currently led by Vinod Nair, who is a research scientist at DeepMind. So what we're hoping to do with this project is to leverage learning in order to exploit the distribution-specific structure of our mixed integer programs to construct better optimizers. So what happens at training time is that we learn how to optimize on the set of training instances that we can see. And then our neural optimizer at test time would provide good solutions much faster compared to traditional solvers. And at the same time, we can even improve the solution quality with such a neural optimizer. So solving a BIP in our proposed approach to doing that has two components: the neural diving component, which essentially guides the second component to achieve, to get to better solutions faster. And it provides predictions of good initial assignments. So it doesn't assign all the variables, but it would assign many of the variables, the ones that it's most confident about, pretty quickly at inference time. And these best solutions so far will be fed to the second component, which is the neural branching component, that decides which integer variable to branch on. And this branching on means it sets this variable, and then it explores from there what are the values of the optimal values of the remaining variables that have not been set yet. So the depth of this search tree is to a great degree defined by the quality of the solutions that we provide from the neural diving component. Now, where does graph representation learning come into this problem? So we can pretty naturally model a mixed integer program as a bipartite graph. And on one side of the bipartite graph, we have the variable nodes, and on the other side, we have the constraint nodes. And essentially, a graph neural network can be used on top of this graph representation for learning and allows us to handle permutation invariants and variable-sized instances. So we want the same model to operate on problems with a couple of hundreds of constraints of variables up to 1 million constraints of variables we want to be able to generalize to such problems. And one result that we've had so far that has been pretty impressive was, so here the purple and blue curves correspond to a method that relies on neural diving and neural branching, while the remaining curves are more traditional techniques. And we observed that we could reach a 10% optimality gap 5 times faster than state-of-the-art solver that is called SKIP. And this is the first demonstration of learning being able to build this state-of-the-art solver on a large-scale real-world data set, like this Google production packing data set. And this work was published around Christmas as an archive paper. So to conclude, graph representation learning can unlock a lot of potential in different applications where data inherently lies on a graph structure. So we've seen healthcare, optimization, physics, chemistry, all sorts of problems that can be unlocked with these types of techniques. However, there's still a long way to go. First of all, there's benchmarks, standardized benchmarks that are still missing. Quite often the ones used in research works are smaller problems. They're not so representative of the real world challenges that might scale to billions of nodes and billions of edges. We also would ideally like to be able to capture higher order structures with new types of architectures. Like, for example, in Euclidean domains, we have this hierarchical representations that we learn with convolutional neural networks. But the equivalent of those in graphs, which would be like motifs, are not so well captured with the existing architectures. And also, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's many graphs for which we don't know whether the graph structure itself is the best one that we could get. And learning the graph representation itself is quite an open challenge. And so I would like to conclude by advertising the scholarship program in case any of you in the audience are thinking about applying for a master's or PhD degree. This scholarship program by DeepMind is providing financial as well as mentoring support to people from underrepresented backgrounds, either social or ethnic backgrounds. And they're already supporting more than 100 scholars in 12 different countries. So if you would like to learn more about the scholarship program, I would encourage you to visit this webpage. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
So basically, we've been running 5 minutes behind, and I think everybody, including me, had a tendency to use the extra 5 minutes for questions to actually finish presentation. So if you could also please answer the questions in the chat, that would be absolutely awesome. But I thought maybe I'll sneakily take several seconds to just ask one question out of the 50 that I have. So I was wondering in terms of quite several of the models. An example, you were saying what happens and how would you think about the latent variables which could be connected or represent the stronger biases, and specifically where it appeared first was when I was thinking about your research on ASD, where it is, I think, often recognized that the diagnosis is very, very skewed, especially in terms of gender. Mm-hmm. So did you think or do you have any ideas how to include also that bias and think about this extra latent variable or latent layer?
So you're referring to, let's say, providing fair predictions with respect to both genders. For example, making sure that the model can not only, predict the label pretty well for male subjects, but also for female subjects. I think this is what you're referring to,
Yes.
like potentially like protected attributes.
Because like neural networks often actually increase biases. So
Yes.
here, if you have like additional task to decrease bias in this specific.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And there are, this is one of the limitations. The other limitation is that, as the name suggests, it's a spectrum disorder. So posing it as a classification problem has its own, limitations. It's not something that we explored at the time, but of course, it's something that there's a lot of active research on. And actually, there's been a PNAS paper on that by former collaborators, where they're looking at, even more traditional, predictive tasks in medical imaging, where you get more accurate predictions for males because they're overrepresented in the training set versus females. So this is definitely not a solved problem, and it's not something that the framework that we had in this study would address. And of course, it's a natural next step. I had to move on from that, but I'm sure I know that there's ongoing research on that topic of fairness in medical imaging, as well as causality is picking up a lot of interest, and it's something that we need to address before deploying such predictive models in the clinical practice. And that's an excellent point.
Thank you so much.